Well, hello and welcome to the Eagle and Child podcast. We're so glad that you've joined us today. I'm super excited about this next episode. We are going to be looking at Blaise Pascal, an incredible thinker throughout history and also church history. And I am very excited to have my good friend John Adams on the podcast with us today, one of the favorites of the Eagle and Child podcast. So welcome, John. It's so good to see you.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
Yeah. So John, for anyone who doesn't know John, who if you haven't watched any of the earlier episodes that he was on, John has been a missionary in Haiti for the last 9 years. And has had an incredible ministry over there. Obviously, things in Haiti have been very crazy for the last sort of year or so. So John has just moved back to America. But John, can you tell us maybe a little bit about that ministry over there in Haiti?
Yeah, so my parents have had a ministry there for 40 years. They plant churches and start schools and feed the hungry and have a Bible college and a lot of other things. And it's still going, even though we're not there. We have leaders on the ground who are running it right now, but yeah, still going strong.
Wow, well done. That's awesome. And at the end, we'll sort of direct people to some links and different things. If you want to support that ministry, that would be awesome. John also has got a lot of theological training and study under his belt. Is just incredible with history, has done some courses on Theos U, and is just a brilliant thinker and writer. One of my favorites that I know of. He's just such an excellent writer and has done an awesome course on C.S. Lewis on Theos U, and is it Introduction to History or something, or World History, or
the Church History 1 and 2.
Church History, yeah. So definitely go and check those courses out as well. But John, I'm really excited to be talking to you about Blaise Pascal today. Can you give us a little bit of an introduction to who Blaise Pascal is, just his background, his spiritual formation? Who's this guy?
Yeah, Blaise Pascal, in a nutshell, he was a French mathematician and apologist in the 17th century. He only lived 39 years, but he probably accomplished more in that amount of time than I'll ever accomplish in my life.
All of us,
he was one of the world's great polymaths. He knew something about everything. He invented the world's first calculator. Some say the first computer. He made a lot of contributions to science, like Pascal's triangle. He also came up with Pascal's wager, which is a famous argument for the existence of God. And he's probably best known for an unfinished work of apologetics that he left unfinished at his death, which was called the Pensées, which means the thoughts in French.
Wow. Yeah, I love John also fluently speaks French, so I love that you can actually bring that into this discussion on Blaise Pascal. So feel free to do whatever you like in French in this. That would be great. Yeah, brilliant. So how did he become a Christian? What was that sort of trajectory like for him?
Well, I kind of got to start at the beginning of his life. Pascal was born in 1623 in Clermont, which is a small town in central France. His mother died when he was 3. His father, Etienne, he worked for the French government. He was a tax official. And when Pascal was 8, he got a promotion. And so the family moved to Paris. And Pascal's father was kind of a free thinker for his time. He played a major role in all of his children's education. He homeschooled them, and he had the mentality that he's going to let the kids learn what they're ready to learn or what they're eager to learn at the time that they're eager to learn it. And so his plan for Blaise Pascal, his son, was that he would teach him the classical languages, Greek and Latin, from age 11 to age 15. So he actually took all of the other books out of the house, and he was just going to focus on that. But the boy was already into math, and apparently taking all the math books out of the house kind of had a reverse psychological effect. Like from that time forward, all he wanted to do was math. And so eventually the father kind of gave in and let him do math because he was working out geometry proofs, in the dark in his bedroom. And so he saw that he had a great propensity for math and let him kind of follow his passion. He kind of grew up in a interesting time. The 1600s were a time, it's about 100 years after the Protestant Reformation. It's about 100 years before the Enlightenment. So it's a time when science is really beginning to come into its own. It's beginning to develop. It's also like a time when there's a lot of war over religious issues going on all over Europe. Protestants and Catholics are fighting. And as a result of that, like some people are turning to science for answers to ultimate questions. They're fed up with all of the religious infighting, and they're trying to, found a new worldview based on reason alone. And so Pascal kind of grew up in that atmosphere of having to decide, like, what am I? Am I a Catholic? Am I a Protestant? Am I an atheist? What is ultimately the truth? And, there were a lot of people in his day that were kind of holding on to the old system, one God, one church, one country. And there are other people that are saying, let's leave all that religion stuff behind. It's too divisive. Let's just focus on science and progress. And Pascal, in his own life, was kind of caught between those two worlds. When he was a teenager, or when he was a young boy, Descartes wrote the Discourse on Method, which basically said that it was a philosophical argument that, you should practice radical skepticism toward anything that can't be known with absolute certainty by the mind, which obviously ruled out religion and most religious claims. And then he also saw Galileo get put under house arrest by the Catholic Church for daring to teach that the Earth revolved around the sun rather than the other way around. And so that's the kind of the milieu that he grew up in. He was very gifted. And because his father worked for the government, he had the opportunity to attend scientific conferences and kind of mingle with the best of the best, from the time he was very young. And, before long, he was making discoveries of his own. He started experimenting. He actually formulated the law of hydraulics, which don't ask me to explain how that works. Yeah. I'm not a science guy. But he figured it out, and he wrote a paper proving the existence of the vacuum. He designed the first syringe. He actually invented the first wristwatch. He designed the first bus route in Paris. So he had a lot of different gifts, a lot of different interests. When he was 19, there's a famous story that says he actually invented the world's first very primitive computer. His father was very busy. He was always working with numbers because he was a tax man. And to save his father time, he invented a calculating machine that could cut his workload in half. And so in some ways, it kind of seemed like the world was his oyster. Like he could do anything. He was well connected. He had plenty of money. He was young. It might not have seemed like he would have had much place in his heart for God. And yet the other side of Pascal was that he actually had known a lot of suffering over the first 19 years of his life. His mother died when he was 3. He was an invalid from a very early age. Basically for his entire life, he couldn't eat solid food. He always had to have other people kind of take care of him. Some of his experiments in physics, other people had to do them. Like he had one experiment that had to do with atmospheric pressure. And so somebody had to climb a mountain to prove that, I can't remember exactly what they had to prove, but he couldn't do it himself. He had to send his friend to climb the mountain for him because he was in such poor health. Wow. And when he was 23, his father slipped on some ice and broke his leg really badly, like the bone was poking out of the flesh. And so Blaise Pascal went and hired a couple of surgeons to move into the house with them for a few months and set the bone and help his father recuperate. And it just so happened that these men were Jansenists. Jansenism was a movement within the Catholic Church at that time that really emphasized the teachings of Augustine, the grace of God, the sovereignty of God, predestination. And these guys, started talking to Pascal while they were treating his father and over these few months, and they converted him to their point of view. Pascal became convinced that what they were saying was the truth. And I think Jansenism appealed to Pascal on a couple of different levels. One was Jansenism is pretty close to Calvinism. And if you've ever spent much time around Calvinism, you know this is a system, a theological system that's very logical, right? There's a lot of logical arguments being made in it. And that goes back to Augustine, who was that way. And that appealed, I think, to Pascal's mathematical mind. Like he likes for things to make sense, to be provable, to be airtight. But I think it appealed to him on another level, too, because Pascal had known so much suffering in his life. This idea that like everything is kind of part of God's plan, that even suffering is part of God's sovereign will, and that he works all things together for the good of believers, is obviously a biblical teaching. And I think that appealed to Pascal on a different level, that maybe his suffering, the kind of seeming absurdity of life is not in vain. There's a real undercurrent of sadness to a lot of Pascal's writing. Like Pascal can be gloomy, but he never makes a gloomy impression on the reader, like other people have pointed that out. Like it's actually kind of refreshing to read him because he's so honest. Like he can just be searingly honest, and yet like it leaves you feeling better. But
wow.
Sometimes the things that he's talking about can be very dark. Like, for example, one thing that Pascal says about life, he compares life to people being stuck in a prison. And every once in a while, the guards come in and take someone out for execution. And the rest of us stay in the prison house, basically living with that dread and that anxiety. And, that I think that resonates with a lot of people's experience of the world. We know that death is coming. There's a lot of suffering and kind of seeming meaninglessness in this life. Every once in a while things get shaken up. And so that's Pascal's vision of life. And yet his conviction, I think, gave him a sense of peace that, things are not the way they're supposed to be right now because of the fall. And yet God is at work. He's sovereign, and even the worst suffering is going to work out for the good of people who love God. Pascal converted to Jansenism, and under his influence, basically his entire family became Jansenists. His younger sister, Jacqueline, became a nun at the convent, the Jansenist convent outside of Paris called Port Royal. And yet, ironically, Pascal himself did not immediately go into the religious life. Pascal was actually torn between kind of his life as a scientist and the wealth and acknowledgement that brought, and his new religious faith for about 8 years. And he actually didn't fully pursue Christ until what he called his Night of Fire. And so it's a very famous event if you've ever read anything about Christian history. November 23rd, 1654, Pascal has like a sort of vision of Christ on the cross, and he tries to communicate whatever this vision was on paper. He actually writes it down. He calls it his memorial. And it's really just a bunch of sentence fragments. It's obvious that something heavy was happening, but you can't quite catch what it is, but you can kind of get it, by reading his words. Here's just an excerpt of what he wrote. He says, from about 10:30 in the evening until about 12:30, and then he has an all caps, fire, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not the God of philosophers and savants. Certitude, feeling, joy, peace. So, you can Google it and read the whole thing if you're interested. It's a beautiful piece of writing, and it kind of communicates that, some of what was going on in his heart. So after he had this experience, at that point, he moved in to Port Royal, kind of gave up his earthly pursuits, and he never wrote anything under his own name ever again. And so it's at that point that Pascal becomes an apologist. Now, the first thing that Pascal kind of gets into, Pascal, after this point, gets himself into a series of controversies. I don't think he quite means to, but he keeps kind of upsetting people and then having to, defend his point of view in writing. And so the first thing that was going on was that the Jansenist movement had actually attracted negative attention from the rest of the Catholic Church. So there was this other group called the Jesuits, who were kind of like the Pope's attack dogs. They were the guys who went around making sure that there was no heresy going on in France. And there was a lot of heresy going on in France, and so they were very busy. And so they caught wind of the Jansenists, and to them, the Jansenists sounded very Protestant, which they do. And basically, they decided that the Jansenists are a little too Protestant for comfort, and so they are trying to get Port Royal shut down. They're trying to label the Jansenists as heretics. And so Pascal has to write a rebuttal, which he calls the Lettres Provinciales, the provincial letters, basically rebutting the Jesuit arguments and defending Jansenism. And so basically the heart of the dispute was over whether God's grace is inclusive or exclusive. And so the Jesuits, God's grace is inclusive. Basically the Jesuits believed that as long as somebody adhered outwardly to the Catholic Church, they were good. They would be saved, they would go to heaven. They kind of had a lowest common denominator vision of Christianity. And Pascal disagreed. He said God's grace is exclusive. He said God only gives grace to those whom he chooses, very Augustinian. And if he's given it to you, people will know it because your life will change. There will be outward marks that God has bestowed his grace upon you. And so he accuses the Jesuits of kind of diluting Jesus's teaching, watering it down for the lowest common denominator. He insists that Christianity has to be a demanding morality founded on the love of God. And he kind of accuses the Jesuits of wanting to update Christianity and make it easier for modern people. He says they basically believe that, okay, Augustine was good enough for his own day, but we need teaching for modern times. And Pascal says, if religious truth is eternal, if Augustine was right in his day, he's still right today. And so the book wasn't very well received by the church hierarchy. The Pope put it on the index of forbidden books, which basically meant you would go to jail if you were caught reading it. But everyone in France read it anyway, partly because Pascal wrote he didn't write like in a dry theological style. He wrote very like biting, witty, satirical kind of attacks on the Jesuits. And it was kind of like the 17th century equivalent of must-see TV. Like everybody wanted to see the Jesuits get owned. So the provincial letters succeeded, and at that point, the legal attacks on Jansenism kind of backed off for a little bit, and so Pascal actually started writing another book, which was a book intended to try to win his skeptical contemporaries back to faith. He knew that a lot of people in the scientific world that he had been in were abandoning Christianity, were leaving the faith. And he wanted to write something that would win them back. And he never finished it. He had hundreds of little fragments all over his house at the time of his death, and somebody gathered them up, and an editor actually like organized them and collected them into the Pensée, which you can buy today and read. But they're fragmentary because he never had the chance to actually finish the book. But the Pensée is an apologetic, and it basically follows a three-step method. His approach to trying to convince unbelievers was basically to first show that religion is not contrary to reason, but worthy of reverence and respect. That's his first goal. Next, to make religion attractive so that good men wish it were true, and then to show that it is true. And so step one for Pascal is to show that Christianity isn't contrary to reason. He's not trying to prove Christianity by reason necessarily, but he's just trying to show that it's not against reason. It's not unreasonable. And he has a lot of different arguments that he makes in the book. If somebody wants to, look at the book and see what he says, they can. One of the things that's interesting about the book is that he spends as much time saying that people are unreasonable as he does as saying that Christianity is reasonable. And so he's very skeptical of the skeptics' reliance on reason. He's like, people are actually not really governed by reason, like they claim to be. But he says at one point, like a fly buzzing in the ear of a judge can change the verdict, depending on the day. Like we're not as governed by reason as we would like to think. And he says one of the most unreasonable things that people do is that they spend most of their lives avoiding life's most important questions. The most important question in life is there anything after death? Like what happens when we die? And people spend most of their time thinking about anything else. They plunge themselves into constant distractions to avoid thinking too hard about anything. And so he says that man is great and wretched at the same time. He says, man is, on the one hand, man is wretched. He's a nothing compared to the infinite. He's a fragile bag of bones that lives his life on the precipice of death. He's easily distracted. He says, man is so vain that the slightest thing, like pushing a ball with a billiard cue, is enough to divert him. He's morally corrupt. Nothing is surer than that men will be weak. And he spends almost all of his time trying to distract himself from his own condition. He says, if our condition were truly happy, we should not need to divert ourselves from thinking about it. He says that we're tortured by our passions, especially the passion for glory. And we end up making ourselves even unhappier than we already are. And his famous quote is that all of man's unhappiness results from his inability to sit quietly in a room with himself, which is an amazing quote when you really think about it. You think about how hard it is for anyone to do that. I don't know if you've ever tried to do that. Just sit in a room and 5 minutes will go by and it feels like an hour. And we're constantly, having to distract ourselves and entertain ourselves. And, in the smartphone era, we've now solved the problem, right? We never have to be alone with our thoughts ever. But Pascal says that's actually the problem, is we're not at peace with ourselves. And so we're constantly getting ourselves into more trouble.
Wow.
So man is wretched, but on the other hand, he says man is also great. The size of man's ambitions in and of themselves hint at the fact that we're made for something much greater than the terrible condition that we're living in.
Yeah,
man acts and desires and thinks like a god, even though he's, basically an animal. And so Pascal sums it up by saying that man's greatness lies in the fact that he knows that he is wretched. And so that man is great and wretched at the same time. So Pascal tries to show that Christianity explains both the greatness and the wretchedness of man. He says any system of thought that's worth its time has to explain both of those facts. Man is great and man is wretched. And he says Christianity explains both, because we're created in the image of God, so we're great, and we've fallen into sin and are under the curse, and so we're also wretched. And Christianity also offers a way out. He says, Christ, the God-man, has entered into our wretchedness so that he might restore us to our lost greatness. And from there, Pascal gets very Augustinian, and he basically says that the way to be restored, the way out of our dilemma, is for God to reorder our loves. So Pascal believed that there were three orders of loves that people can live for. People can live for the body, the mind, or the heart. So the lowest order of loves, he says, is what the body loves. This is people who live for money, sex, and power, right? So life lived for what the body loves, he says, ends in sorrow, because once those things are taken away, the person has nothing left to live for. So the next order of loves is what the mind loves, which are things like reason and logic and truth. This is what the scientist loves. He says, the mind can't bring us all the way to God, and it can be blinded by pride, but it can at least lead us to an awareness that there is something beyond itself, that there's something greater than itself. So Pascal doesn't see reason as the end all be all like many of his contemporaries did. He says reason's last step is the recognition that there are an infinite number of things which are beyond it. And so he says where God reaches us is not through the body or through the mind, but through the heart. And by the heart, he doesn't just mean the emotions. He means the kind of intuitive grasp of goodness, truth, and beauty that people have. He said the heart has reasons that reason knows nothing about. And so once the will is oriented toward God's will, he says, the body and the mind will kind of come into alignment with it. But if the heart refuses to submit to God's will, a person will be dominated by their passions and their mind will not be at peace. And so that's where Pascal's famous wager comes in. You may have heard of Pascal's wager. People often misinterpret the wager as a call to blind faith, to believing without any evidence, which is not exactly what Pascal was saying. Pascal thought there was plenty of evidence for God. He just didn't think the evidence we have available to us can lead anyone to certainty, because it's actually not the mind that is the organ by which we come to know God. It's the heart. But people still have to make a decision, based on the amount of evidence they have available that could possibly affect eternity. And so how does a person do that? And Pascal kind of approaches this question like a mathematician. A lot of people haven't found his solution satisfying, but I think it's helpful if you see it kind of from the right angle. So Pascal invented this thing called probability theory, which is basically today the mathematical underpinning of sports betting. I've never bet on any sports, but this is what people use to kind of determine what is a good bet and what is not a good bet. And in sports betting, there's a concept called expected value, or EV. So to use a simple illustration, if somebody handed you a die and told you, it's $1 per roll, you can roll as many times as you want. If you roll a 6, you win $10. Would you take that? Would you roll the dice?
Yeah, sure. I don't really bet, so.
Why would you roll?
Wait, what's the question? So I can only roll once and spend $1?
No, you can roll as many times as you want. You have to pay $1 every time you roll. But if you roll a 6, you win $10.
Yeah, because it's like 1 in 6 chance. So
right.
It sounds like high probability to me that I'd get it.
Yeah, even if you roll wrong the first 5 times, the 6th time you win $6, right?
Yeah.
And so you're always going to come out on top as long as you keep rolling. And so, that's called a positive expected value. It's a plus EV decision. And so Pascal, to the person who's kind of like wrestling with the question of God, like, I want to have absolute certainty, like Descartes tells me I should have. My heart is kind of pointing toward Christ, but, I don't know if I should make this decision if I can't have absolute mental certainty about the questions of faith. And Pascal, at this point that Pascal comes in with Pascal's wager, he says, basically, you should take the bet, because if you're right, you win everything, right? I mean, you live a pretty good life in this life, and then in eternity, you get everything. Yeah, and if you're wrong, you don't actually lose all that much. And if you don't take the bet, if you reject Christ, if you're right, you haven't gained all that much. Maybe a little bit of earthly pleasure, some of what you wanted to do that you wouldn't have been able to do as a Christian. But if you're wrong, then you lose everything. You open yourself up to infinite risk.
Wow. Yeah.
And so Pascal basically says that in that situation, the person, who's kind of on the fence about faith should take the bet. She should follow her heart, bet on Christ. It's a plus EV decision. At some point, it'll pay off. And so Pascal is kind of the first person to write an apologetic for the modern era. So he sees that the old order of things, where people are expected to accept things based on the authority of institutions like the church, is kind of crumbling. Like that whole world is kind of disappearing. At the same time, he also sees that the modern replacement for it, that's kind of putting all their chips on reason, is also going to crumble. And I think we're seeing that borne out in our own day, that reason itself isn't sufficient. And so Pascal is saying that, we have to decide. Like we have these huge decisions before us. We can't get all the way to any particular position based on reason alone, but we still have to live our lives, and so we have to make a choice. So Pascal's thinking in that regard leads down the road to another form of philosophy called existentialism, which begins with Soren Kierkegaard and some other people. Existentialism in the 20th century became the idea that we kind of, we can't really know what the ultimate purpose or meaning of life is. We just kind of have to create one for ourselves. Pascal wouldn't have agreed with that. Pascal was a Christian. He would have said that, there is objective meaning to our life, and, the gospel provides meaning, but we do have to commit ourselves to it in order to fully know it. The gospel and religious questions are something that are known through the heart before they're known through the reason. And the heart and the mind work in tandem, but primarily we make our decisions and know Christ by faith. Dietrich Bonhoeffer says, only he who believes obeys, and only he who obeys believes. Pascal's had a big influence on some of the more modern writers like C.S. Lewis, because Pascal attached so much importance to the heart. Pascal tried to appeal not only to the reason, but to the imagination.
Wow.
Pascal recognized that people's hearts are not neutral on religious questions. He said, men despise religion. They hate it, and they're afraid it may be true. And so before the apologist can convince someone that the gospel is true, oftentimes he has to convince them that they should want it to be true, because it satisfies the deepest longings of their hearts. Tim Keller wrote an article a few years ago on Pascal, and he talked about this, and I'll quote him. He says, "Do we take time to talk about the manifold and astonishing blessings of salvation? Do we give time and effort to explaining the new birth, our new name and identity, adoption into God's family, the experience of God's love and beholding Christ's glory, the slow but radical change in our character, a growing freedom from our past and peace in our present, power and meaning in the face of suffering, membership in a new, universal, multiracial, countercultural community, a mission to do justice and mercy on the earth, guidance from and personal fellowship with God himself, relationships of love that go on forever, the promise of our own future perfection and glorious beauty, complete confidence in the face of death, and the new heavens and new earth, a perfectly restored material world." I've had friends and known people before who do street preaching, who kind of get out on the corner and yell at people, turn or burn kind of approach to evangelism. And I ultimately, have come to believe that that's not really that effective, because most people who experience that they don't want that to be true. Their heart hasn't been appealed to yet. Their imagination hasn't been stirred. And so the words, even though they might technically be correct, actually don't sink in, because they're just appealing to somebody's mind rather than to their heart.
Wow.
I don't know if you've ever seen The Chosen. It's a TV series.
Yeah, I love The Chosen. Yeah.
Yeah. I've been really encouraged and blessed by that recently, just to see the show and just to kind of be reawakened through that show to how beautiful the gospel stories actually are. Yeah. And I think as we evangelize, as we preach the gospel, as we share the gospel with other people, that's what we're aiming for. We're aiming for a gospel presentation that appeals to the heart as well as the mind, that kind of makes somebody long for Jesus to actually be true. And then we can show them that the gospel is true. At that point, they're ready to receive it. Pascal, as we said, never finished the Pensée. He died at the age of 39. He had a stomach ulcer and meningitis, so he was not in good health. Before he died, though, he wrote a prayer to God asking him to help him use his sickness properly. And it's a remarkable statement of faith in the midst of suffering. Even on his deathbed, even though he was in terrible pain, Pascal still believed that Jesus was a positive, expected value decision. This is what he prayed. He said, Lord, whose spirit is so good and so gentle, grant that I may conform to thy will just as I am, that being sick as I am, I may glorify thee in my sufferings. Unite my will with thine, and my sufferings with those that thou hast suffered. Grant that mine may become thine. Unite me with thee, and thus, having some small part in thy suffering, I shall be filled wholly by thee with the glory which it has brought to thee, the glory in which thou dost dwell with the Father and the Holy Spirit forever and ever. Amen.
Wow.
So that's Pascal in a nutshell.
I love it. John, that's an incredible overview. I love how you mentioned like some of those big events that Fire Night and, the big works that he's been involved in. Are there any other events or works that you want to share that you haven't mentioned yet that were really important that Pascal is known for?
Pascal really just wrote 2 books. He wrote the Provincial Letters, which I haven't read, and he wrote the Pensées, which I have. And, and he also had the prayer in his sickness, which I read an extract from. It's much longer than what I read. And he also had the Night of Fire, his kind of conversion experience, which I also didn't read all of. But yeah, that's all the writing that he did.
Mm-hmm. And you already mentioned as well some of the inventions and things that he's known for. So maybe we can move into just an idea about like what influence has he had throughout, church history, and then also like how does he influence us today as a 21st century church? Like what ideas can we take away from Pascal and really incorporate into our modern lives?
Yeah, I think he's had a lot of influence on how Christians do apologetics. Mm-hmm. Like Pascal couldn't depend on having an officially kind of Christian nation to enforce faith on people anymore. They were kind of that world was breaking apart, and so Pascal he kind of provides a model of how to appeal to modern secular people. People who prioritize reason above everything else. He has this, whole theory about, the heart has reasons that reason does not know. And he really exemplifies, really well how to kind of pierce through people's kind of casual assumptions and appeal to the imagination and not just to the reason, to kind of get people you have to get people in the right mindset to kind of start to make them long for holiness, long for truth, sometimes before the mind can be convinced. And so I know C.S. Lewis, he quotes Pascal several times in Mere Christianity. I think he was pretty influenced by Pascal as well. John Wesley was heavily influenced by Pascal's prayer on sickness. He read it often. So he's had an effect on different people throughout church history.
Beautiful. Do you have any quotes that you'd like to share from Pascal? Anything that he's known for? Maybe some famous ones or some quotes that you have been particularly moved by?
I think I've shared all of the quotes that I had mined from him. He's very acerbic. He can be very very dry and witty in some ways. Like he often says things like, I don't know if I'll get the quote exactly right because I don't have it written down, but he says basically, none of the other religions have believed in the depravity of man, and so they're all wrong. It's like, if you can't see, the empirical evidence of man's depravity, then you're not on the right track.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's so fascinating. And you mentioned the quote about reason and the heart or love or whatever that one was. What's that one? Like the heart has reasons that reasons doesn't know, or something like that.
Yeah, he said the heart has reasons that reason knows nothing about. Yeah. He says the people can know something intuitively before their mind is convinced. And so, one of the things that people often threw at him in his day was that, well, it's always the most uneducated people, the simplest people that are believers, right? Like the educated people, know that that's all a bunch of superstition. And Pascal says, I'm not surprised at all to see, that sometimes people who have little education sees things by intuition that people who are too educated for their own good, don't get. And that's in line with what Jesus said. You've revealed these things to little children and hidden them from the wise and of this world. And so Pascal, his idea is that the heart, the intuition often grasps goodness, truth, and beauty before the mind does. But somebody who's become to place so much pride and emphasis on their mind will often ignore their intuition and often turn out to be wrong.
So good, John. That's such a profound thought. We usually like to end the podcast, as you know, with just an interesting fact or a fun story or anything like that. Is there anything from Pascal that you can think of that would fall in line with that?
Yeah, so Pascal died at the age of 39, and his servant was cleaning out his estate, cleaning out his belongings, and picked up his coat that he had worn every day for years and discovered a lump inside the lining of the coat. And so they actually cut the lining out and pulled out a piece of paper. When they opened it up, it had his Night of Fire conversion experience on it. And he had never shared that with anyone. And we would never have known about it if it wasn't for that servant who felt the lump in the lining of his coat.
Crazy, hey? That's so powerful. Sort of divine sort of happening, hey?
Providence.
It's incredible how God. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, John, thank you so much for sharing so brilliantly and so articulately about Blaise Pascal. Is there anything else that we should know about Blaise Pascal, or if people want to get more into him, is there anything that you would recommend?
I'll just pick up a copy of the Pensée. There's good translations available, and it's really accessible, and you don't feel like you have to read it in order because there are a bunch of scattered loose thoughts, and so you can really just jump all over. It's like the book of Proverbs. You can start anywhere and work your way around and quickly get to know this brilliant Frenchman.
Beautiful. And if people want to connect with you, how can they do that?
You can follow me on Instagram at John Adams to go. And you can also look up my parents' ministry. It's hard to spell. Rehoboth, Haiti.
Rehoboth. Can you spell it for us?
Rehoboth. So if you Google that, Rehoboth Ministries Haiti, you'll probably find my mom's blog, and you should be able to connect with our ministry that way.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, John. Thank you for a brilliant episode. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today as well. We will catch you next time on the Eagle and Child podcast. See you then. Bye. Thanks so much for tuning into the Eagle and Child podcast. That's all from us for today. If you want to support us, you can like, subscribe, or drop us a review. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Eagle and Child podcast. We'll catch you next time. Much love.